Kiev launched attacks and gained ground in multiple locations along the front line using experienced infantry units, deliberate attacks, and small-scale offensive tactics. The Ukraine continues to lead its offensive to gain ground and inflict casualties. In the first 2 weeks, the Ukrainian Armed Forces counter-offensive has been deliberate and methodical on the Ukrainian battlefield. However, things have begun to become clearer over the past 2 weeks. Kiev redirected offensive operations toward 4 distinct front lines: the conflict zone encompassing Luhansk and Donetsk in the east of Ukraine, Kharkiv in the north, and Crimea in the south were among the locations where the war broke out. Strategic regions such as Zaporizhia, the Dnipro-Kherson, Critical Front, Melitopol, Tokmak, and Berdichev are among the southern front lines on Ukraine's eastern front lines. Bakhmut, Klissarivka, Kurumeku, Markivka, Kresnaya, Gora, and Popasna are among the most active localities on the eastern front lines. Ukrainian forces began employing the same military strategies as in the southern regions, combining drones and armored vehicles. Ukrainians conducted targeted attacks against short-range targets, typically no more than 2 forest lines or villages. Ukrainian flags soaring over settlements in the Donetsk region and Zaporizhia Oblast were cited by Ukraine as evidence of early progress. There was concern that the collapse of the Novokakhovka Dam in the region of Kherson, which Kiev blames on Moscow, would impact Ukraine's counterattack plans. Kiev declared the offensive to be underway. Andriy Kovalev, a spokesman for the Ukrainian General Staff, recently reported that Kiev forces have liberated more than 400 kilometers squared since the counteroffensive began. Hanna Maliar, the Deputy Minister of Defense for Ukraine, stated that the operation was conducted in at least 4 directions. The Kiev forces liberated a 28 square kilometer area in the city of Bakhmut, and the city was operationally besieged around the border between Donetsk and Zaporizhia. Minister Maliar reported that up to 5 kilometers of progress had been made and approximately 50 mi of territory had been liberated in the direction of Bakhmut. Ukrainian defenders gained the strategic initiative. The Ukrainian armed forces are conducting a comprehensive frontal assault. Andriy Kovalev, spokesman for the Ukrainian General Staff, addressed the issue during a telethon broadcast. He reported that Ukrainian forces continue defensive operations in the Bakhmut, Melitopol, and Berdyansk areas. Thus, in the regional Pole-Volodin direction along the border between the Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions, the Ukrainian armed forces achieved partial success and occupied a position on the obtained lines in the direction of Bakhmut. Conflict remains intense. According to Andriy Kovalev, Ukrainian troops seized the strategic initiative in the designated sector of the front in the direction of Bakhmut. Ukrainian forces have assumed the initiative and are undertaking wide front offensive operations. They continue to exert pressure on the enemy on the flanks of the city of Bakhmut. They burst through the previously captured lines. They are victorious. They maintain the captured lines. The Ukrainian armed forces have taken control of Kleshchevovka. The Ukrainian defenders achieved complete air superiority over Bakhmut. This effective Ukrainian advance culminated in offensive operations in the direction of Tavria. The Russians of the Ukrainian Defense Forces continue to disseminate their positions in this region. The Ukrainian commander reported that approximately 500 Russian soldiers were annihilated in the direction of Tavria as Ukrainian forces proceeded to attack at full speed on the Tavria axis in southern Ukraine. Approximately 5 Russian military divisions were lost. This number is absurdly excessive. Never before had the Russian suffered such a large number of casualties. 6 Russian ammunition depots and 500 Russian servicemen were the most notable casualties sustained in Tavria. 56 pieces of Russian military hardware were annihilated or damaged during offensive operations in Tavria. 9 tanks, 30 heavy armored combat vehicles, and 7 special Soviet howitzers were the most notable losses of the Russian army. The Russians lost a Strela 10 air defense system, an Uragan air defense system, 3 vital electronic warfare systems, a Pole, 2 electronic warfare system, and 4 unmanned aerial vehicles on the Tavria front. The Russian losses sustained in a single assault against the Ukrainian forces were officially acknowledged by the Ukrainian General Staff. This was one of the greatest losses suffered by the Russian army in a single region during daily combat. This accomplishment belonged to the 10th Ukrainian Operational Army. The 10th Operational Corps of Ukraine is where the most elite Ukrainian brigades are recruited and comprises units with tremendous offensive capabilities. The Russian forces lack the necessary equipment and personnel to counter such a massive offensive. The surviving Russian soldiers retreated into the interiors of Donetsk and Luhansk. The commander of the Tavria Operational Strategic Unit Formation, General Alexander Tarnavsky, stated the defenders of the Tavria region continue to destroy the invaders with confidence. In recent days, the Ukrainian armed forces have begun to advance towards Volodar from the direction of Tavria. The Ukrainians' objective was to establish an offensive corridor from Zaporizhia to the front lines and to seize control of the territory between Donetsk and Luhansk. Recently, the Ukrainian military made a significant advancement in this regard in the region of Volodar. Ukrainian defense forces advanced 1 kilometer in the direction of Tavria. Critical developments were anticipated in Volodar, with the Ukrainians acquiring a significant advantage in the offensive corridors of Zaporizhia and Donetsk. Therefore, it is not remarkable that the Ukrainians sent reinforcements from the direction of Tavria to Volodar. Also, if you recall, the Ukrainian Defense Forces missile and artillery units in the direction of Tavria recently accomplished a total of 1577 firing missions in the concluding Ukrainian advance in the direction of Bakhmut, resulted in significant gains. The Ukrainian armed forces seized possession of Vika. This is an important location for offensive operations south of Bakhmut. Also successful is the 57th Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces north of Bakhmut. Today we are able to say that the adversary has retreated from the northern regions of Bakhmut, particularly the internationalist soldiers. Denis Yaroslavsky, commander of the Ukrainian reconnaissance elements of the 57th Motor Brigade, stated that the Ukrainian forces are liberating Shvika and that intense fighting is occurring in the region. Denis Yaroslavsky added that the Ukrainian forces had dislodged the Russian forces from their positions on the western outskirts of Bakhmut, and that fighting was ongoing near Byrkvik. Yaroslavsky also stated that the liberation of the prominent high positions at Berky, Vika and Vika would enable the Ukrainian forces to operationally encircle the Russian forces at Bakhmut. Hanna Maliar, the Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, stated that Ukrainian forces had advanced 1,200 meters in the direction of Vika and 1,500 meters in the direction of Kazhumyaka. In addition, Minister Maliar reported that the Russian forces conducted counterattacks in these regions but retreated at certain locations after suffering losses. These startling news reports demonstrated that the Ukrainians had opened the gates of the fortress of war Bakhmut. In other words, the Russian resistance in Bakhmut began to completely crumble after the Zaporizhia front. A decisive Ukrainian victory in this city in the eastern trenches would cause Russia great difficulty, according to Ukraine's general staff. Ukrainian forces have recovered the strategic initiative in the direction of Bakhmut and are conducting a massive operation in the region. This was the most concrete evidence that something had changed in the city for which both factions of the war had fought for months. The benefits of Bakhmut did not end here. Kiev's offensive strategies in the east were generally designed to seize the Russians' bridgeheads, dams, and connection roadways. If you recall, after the Novokakhovka Dam in the region of Kherson collapsed, the majority of Russian trenches were submerged by dismantling this dam. The Russians prepared themselves for defeat on the southern front. The Ukrainian armed forces were able to seize possession of numerous dams, bridges, and supply lines on the southern front lines, at this time on Ukraine's eastern front lines, particularly south of Jivika. The same strategy as in Kiev was employed after the Ukrainians captured Bakhmut and Vika. He altered his trajectory to Mvyukyur. The Russians were unable to prevent Ukrainian forces from crossing Shvika and advancing to Kurgyamenka. The disadvantage for the Russians in this region was that the Wagner forces had lost their effectiveness and were no longer engaged in combat along these front lines. In addition, the presence of only the 3rd Motorized Brigade of the Russians in the vicinity of Kradimka facilitated the commencement of an offensive operation against the Ukrainians. Therefore, the Ukrainians seized this opportunity and initiated a massive offensive against Kurdy Mvyukyur. The 28th Specialized Rifle Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces carried out intense artillery and heavy missile attacks against the Russians in this city. After prolonged clashes, the Ukrainian armed forces hoisted the Ukrainian flag on the Kurdyumov Dam. The video of these historical moments was viewed by millions of social media users. Russian leader Vladimir Putin remained silent after the Ukrainian flag was hoisted in Crimea. Kremlin officials also preferred not to make a statement on this issue. Already, it was repeatedly reported by the Kiev authorities that the Ukrainian army had seized the initiative in Bakhmut and had breached the eastern front lines. But no one expected that the Ukrainian army would wave Ukrainian flags on the eastern front lines in such a short period of time. The striking moments at Kajamarka may have reminded Moscow of the Ukrainian offensive operations in Zaporizhia, because on the Zaporizhia front line, Ukrainian troops liberated 9 settlements and waved their own flags in these regions. What Putin now has to worry about is not whether the 28th Specialized Rifle Brigade hoists the Ukrainian flag on the dam at Koryukivka, but whether this advance will continue in the rest of the Donbass front line. The current course shows that these striking offensive operations by the Ukrainian forces will continue in other areas of the Eastern Front. If one of Putin's biggest fears comes true, that is if Ukrainians fly their national blue and yellow flags in the city of Bakhmut, the tide of the war will change quite a bit. In addition, the advance of Ukrainian troops in and around Bakhmut was confirmed by Russian sources. Russian Mil bloggers claimed that Ukrainian forces were advancing along the E40 near Zalizniak, i.e., Bakhmut-Slovyansk, and conducting offensive operations in the direction of Yadin and Taraskivka. On the other hand, Ukrainian Eastern Forces Group spokesman Colonel Sergei Sharavathy reported that the Russians transferred an unnamed Russian Air Force regiment from the Kremenna region to Bakhmut to reinforce their forces in the region. In other words, the Russians even mobilized their troops in the Luhansk region to recapture Bakhmut, but it was already too late. Ukrainian troops have reached the central front lines of Bakhmut, and now blue-yellow flags are about to be flown in the city. After these attacks, the Russian forces also predicted that the Ukrainians would head towards Vlada after the Zaporizhia front lines. The intensity of the fighting near Bakhmut was somewhat diminished as Ukraine carried out successful offensive actions in certain areas, captured the dominant heights and forest belts, and made every effort to stop the advance by reinforcing the enemy's troops. Independent information sources and Russian military bloggers all agree that Kiev's top military leadership has so far followed the conservative strategy of eroding Russian formations over time, gradually gaining ground, avoiding major risks, and limiting Ukrainian losses as much as possible. Even pro-Russian sources admit that Ukraine's deliberate tactics are unusual, but undeniably gaining ground. Putin is experiencing an early setback in Ukraine's counteroffensive. Despite taking measures against the long-awaited Ukrainian offensive, Russian President Vladimir Putin seems to have a headache because he again underestimated the Ukrainians, considering the heavy blows he received on the front and the areas lost. Russia, which is on the brink of economic collapse, cannot easily replace its very expensive equipment. Therefore, it is likely that antique equipment from the Soviet Union will enter Russia's weapon inventory. The Russian army's situation is worsening as it faces a Ukrainian army that has state-of-the-art weapons and uses them efficiently. The losses of the Russian army due to operations organized by the Ukrainian army is increasing, according to the latest updates. Since the beginning of the invasion, the Russian army has lost about 150,000 military personnel, 3,395 tanks, 6,638 armored infantry fighting vehicles, 2,393 artillery systems, 479 MLRS-247, anti-aircraft systems, 300 aircraft, 2055, drones, 5,257 tankers and supply vehicles, and 288 helicopters. With the Ukrainian army's operation against the airjet base in the days when Russia's losses were increasing, panic in Russia reached its highest level. The possibility that the vehicles, which have already been discarded and sent to Ukraine, will now be destroyed within Russian borders poses a dangerous situation for Russia as long as the occupation continues. The situation seems to increase Russia's losses even more, ensure that a prolonged occupation will end with a defeat on Russian soil. What is needed for success in war? The first answer to this question is soldiers and equipment, because the strength of armies is measured by the number of military personnel and equipment. But is this equation valid in all circumstances? Of course not. When we look at the developments in the Russia-Ukraine war in detail, it is clear that this equation is not consistent. Russia, which claims to have one of the most powerful armies in the world, cannot succeed against Ukraine. It is claimed that the Russian army has over 2 million soldiers, including reservists. In addition, the Russian army is said to have nuclear weapons and advanced equipment. But why is Russia failing despite all this? There are many reasons for the failure of the Russian army. The most important one is the inexperience of the soldiers in the army. Hundreds of thousands of inexperienced soldiers who did not want to fight and had never served on a front were assigned to invade Ukraine. These soldiers are doing more harm than good to the Russian army. The situation of the Ukrainian army is very different. Immediately after the unjust annexation of Crimea by the Russian occupiers, the Ukrainian army began rigorous training. Thanks to this training, every single soldier in the Ukrainian army has become a professional fighter. During the invasion of Ukraine launched by Putin last year, this situation was clearly revealed. It has become clear that success in war requires trained and experienced soldiers rather than large numbers. The operation carried out by Ukrainian troops the other day demonstrated this. The 36th Separate Marine Brigade of the Ukrainian Army blew up the invading tank platoon in the Donetsk region with a spectacular tactic and ambush as Anchor Taylor News Team. We continue to report the details of this operation carried out by the Ukrainian Army and all the developments in the Russia-Ukraine war. With our understanding of accurate and impartial journalism, you can click on the Super Thanks button to support our teammates and our work. Let's examine the details of the attack carried out by the Ukrainian 36th Separate Marine Brigade. The Ukrainian Army recently carried out a successful operation in the Donetsk region. The tactics prepared before the operation were spectacular. The Ukrainian army cleared a road through an empty field for the Russian invaders to advance. This road was wide enough for a tank or a military vehicle to move in one direction. This was because the Russian army would not be able to retreat once the attack was launched. Russian troops used the road through the wasteland to attack Ukrainian troops, but Ukrainian soldiers were waiting in ambush. Ukrainian soldiers were waiting for Russian military vehicles to pass on the road they had dug. They were armed with Javelin missile systems. These missile systems had been added to the inventory of the Ukrainian army with the help of Western countries such as the UK and the USA. With the Javelin missile systems, the Ukrainian army had made great gains in many regions. Javelin missile systems are both ground-based and lightweight missile systems that can be carried and used on the shoulder. The armor of the missiles launched by this missile system is thin. For this reason, when it reaches the target, it explodes with more violence than expected. Javelin missiles are very effective in destroying tanks and armored vehicles. Ukrainian soldiers waiting in ambush with Javelin missiles prepared to fire when Russian invaders appeared in the area. But seeing that more than one tank would pass through the roads they dug, the soldiers decided to wait because sometimes waiting for an attack means being able to hit many more targets at the same time. Experienced Ukrainian soldiers knew this important information. One tank on the road soon became 5. The time was ripe for an attack. Ukrainian soldiers fired the first missile from a hill out of sight of the Russian invaders. The first missile successfully hit its target. The invading soldiers driving the Russian tanks were surprised. The tanks advancing one after the other thought of turning back. But they failed because the Ukrainian army had dug the road into one lane. Then the second missile was fired and the second Russian tank was blown up. The Ukrainian army was recording all the images of the attack with drone cameras. The third missile hit the target with a direct hit. In the photos of the attack shared on social media, it is seen that 3 occupying soldiers come out of tank hit by a Javelin missile. One of the invaders coming out of the flaming tank has difficulty walking. The other 2 soldiers are trying to escape from the area, but they do not realize that their every move is being watched by Ukrainian drones. In this operation, Ukraine's 36th Marine Separate Brigade blows up 5 Russian tanks one by one. The footage of the attack was watched by millions of people on social media. The 36th Marine Separate Brigade released the following statement about the footage. Have the Javelin fighters of the 36th Separate Brigade of Marines named after Rear Admiral Mikhailo Bolensky burned Russian armored vehicles in Donetsk region is a real art. There were 2 important elements that enabled the Ukrainian army to succeed in this offensive. The first is undoubtedly the professional soldiers. The footage shows soldiers firing Javelin missiles with ease and successfully hitting their targets with a single shot. The second important development that contributed to the success of this attack was the aid provided by Western countries to the Ukrainian army. In the coming days, many powerful military equipment and vehicles will be added to the Ukrainian army's inventory. Military aid from Western and European countries is of great importance in the Russian-Ukrainian war. Almost the entire world is providing military assistance to the Ukrainian army to stop the advance of the Russian invaders. Germany is one of them. In recent months, Germany announced that it would deliver 18 Leopard 2 tanks to the Ukrainian army. These tanks arrived in Ukraine this week. Poland, Norway, and Canada have also delivered the promised Leopard tanks. The Indian Army. Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov spoke about Typekit. Reznikov said he hoped that Western countries would send at least 2 battalions of Leopard tanks by the end of April. In addition, he said that Ukrainian soldiers trained for the tanks sent by the US and France have completed their training. Ukrainian army continues to strengthen. It is said that the Ukrainian army, which is getting stronger day by day, is preparing for a major attack. Oleg Zadornov, a Ukrainian military analyst, made statements on this issue. According to Zadornov, the Ukrainian army will cross the corridor between Russia and Crimea and reach Melitopol and the Sea of Azov from Zaporizhia. Oleg Zadornov explained Ukraine's goal in this offensive as follows: it will split the Russian troops in two and cut the supply lines to the troops for the rest in the direction of Crimea. Ukraine continues to deal heavy blows to the Russian invaders with successful operations. The tide of the war seems to be turning against Putin. When do you think the Ukrainian army will launch its big offensive? What do you think about the tactics and ambushes of the Ukraine's 36th Marine Separate Brigade before the attack? Is the aid provided by Western countries to the Ukrainian army effective in the course of the war? Fearing Ukraine's impending attack, Russian authorities resort to evacuation orders. This is something we are not familiar with. Russian authorities had evacuated civilians from the city of Kherson before Moscow forces withdrew from the city last year. The War Research Institute, a Washington-based think tank, said the evacuation of civilians from frontline areas was also likely designed to pave the way for a controlled withdrawal of Russian troops. Also last month, a Ukrainian official stated that thousands of Russians fled Crimea. The official said that Russians had abandoned their properties, fearing that a counterattack expected in the spring might target the Black Sea Peninsula. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's chief representative in Crimea, Tamila Dasheva, said on national television that the Russians were beginning to worry about Ukraine's effort to retake the region. About 500,000 to 800,000 Russians currently live in Crimea legally. Russians may be forcibly deported in accordance with Ukrainian legislation and international legal norms. Fearing this possibility, Russian citizens sell their properties and leave Crimea. The Russian evacuation of Crimea is also seen in the real estate market. It's not possible to say the exact number by looking at the real estate market, but there are many who leave in November. Emil Ibragimov, head of the Crimean Project and Education Platform Hub, said that the Russians fled from Crimea to the neighboring Russian region of Krasnodar, fearing that Ukraine would eventually liberate the Russian Black Sea Peninsula. On the other hand, it turned out that the Russian administrations in Crimea prepared evacuation plans for their employees. Russian authorities on the peninsula are making a list of workers and their families who are subject to priority evacuation. In fact, it is among the information that escape plans have already been created and approved in some cities. It was announced that such a plan was being prepared in the northern part of the peninsula, close to the Ukrainian mainland in the town of Krasnoperekopsk. When we look back on the past, it's possible to discover a common point. The first precaution taken by the Russian administration, which is afraid of the Ukrainian attack, is to evacuate the cities. So what awaits Russia? Vladimir Putin's strategy has always been based on pinning his opponents against each other by holding a divided house. Putin prevented them from uniting and usurping it. However, since he started the war in Ukraine, Putin may have overplayed his hand in a high-stakes game that could cost him his presidency, if not his life. For more than 2 decades, Putin has successfully pitted different factions of his potential rival's Russian army against Russian intelligence. Different factions within Russia's elite are against each other. Now, private military companies like the Wagner Group against the regular Russian army. The critical flaw in Putin's strategy was that he thought he had created a political, perpetual motion machine that would keep him and his regime in power forever. But the Russian leader's plans are now faltering, And he doesn't seem to realize it because, like most haters, he has an Achilles heel. This is his own arrogance. Vladimir Putin's pride has been blinded by the failures of his war, the rising discontent in the ranks of his army, and the unspoken anger of the Moscow elite. Putin, like other leaders who have been hit by unexpected blows in the past, has yet to realize that he is only beneficial to the elite and society as a whole, so long as he can meet their needs and demands. For years, it was considered that Putin provided stability after the chaos in Russia of the 1990s. Now the president has become the epicenter of Russia's 21st century chaos. Putin is not running a reclusive country, completely cut off from the outside world like North Korea. Rather, it facilitates the rise of dozens of billionaires, many of whom now own private military companies who see the reality of Russia's position in the world, and who have both the means and the motivation to end the House of Putin. Putin will not live forever. Many Russians now find it unreasonable to pull all their chips on a 70-year-old man whose health condition is a constant source of rumors. Many of Putin's favorites, who have survived for years at the whim of their bosses, will undoubtedly lose everything when he's no longer there. To prevent this and ensure their survival, they must start forming alliances. It is also a bitter truth that as long as Putin is behind the wheel of Russia, his ill-fated adventure in Ukraine is on the brink of an abyss. Russia has no road ahead, and there is no turning back at this point. Now, wanted for war crimes, Putin has become a heavy albatross on the necks of the Russian elite. Russia will not be able to get out of its current economic crisis or return to normal until the war in Ukraine is over. Putin's strategy of allowing and even encouraging open disagreements among his subordinates can be deadly. The most obvious example of these disagreements is between Wagner Group leader Prigozhin and the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. But the continued loyalty of his subordinates prevents the military elite from uniting against him. As the war continues to plunge Russia's economy and long-term stability into the abyss, public opinion supporting Putin today may sympathize with the arguments put forward by a figure like Prigozhin. History has shown that ordinary people will often support the harsh speeches of a populist figure like Prigozhin, who put the blame for the invasion of Ukraine on Shoigu's feet. The plot that the Kremlin did not foresee is where people stand and people's thoughts on who should be responsible for Russia's military and economic defeat. If Prigozhin feels his life is in danger, he may choose to forge alliances with other disgruntled oligarchs to go against Putin's interests. Prigozhin's recent jovial meeting with his known rival, the Chechen dictator Ramzan Kadyrov, is proof that politics makes strange bedfellows. But it's also a testament on how he plays politics if he wants to secure someone's future. In the end, it is quite possible that the Prigozhin and Shoigu duo will not survive the post-Putin era. Those who wanted to win the favor of the West melt billions of dollars and end this conflict before it has even more dire consequences for Russia are probably already looking for the Messiah who will start the post-Putin era. They realize that now is the time to avoid the fuss and make the deals they need to see tomorrow's sunrise. The big game of who will come after Putin has already begun. There are undoubtedly many smart people in Moscow who know that Putin's day will come, and they must be on the right side of history. The Kremlin allows their presence to continue. Ordinary citizens are the least priority. A wise politician will know how to transcend the waves of emotion in order to gain the power that is now in Putin's hands. How might the breaking point in the front lines affect Russia in the coming days?